Christian mission is an organized effort for the propagation of the Christian faith. Missions often involve sending individuals and groups, called missionaries, across boundaries, most commonly geographical boundaries, for the purpose of proselytism. This involves evangelism and humanitarian work, especially among the poor and disadvantaged. There are a few different kinds of mission trips: short-term, long-term, relational, and ones meant simply for helping people in need. Some might choose to dedicate their whole lives to missions as well. Missionaries have the authority to preach the Christian faith, and provide humanitarian work to improve economic development, literacy, education, health care, and orphanages. Christian doctrines permit the provision of aid without requiring religious conversion. History of Christian missions. Apostolic period through medieval period. The earliest examples of Christian missionary activity are those recorded in writings that would eventually come to form the New Testament. Early writings include the letters of Apostle Paul, written in the course of his missionary activity in Asia Minor and Greece. His activities were preceded by an expansion of Christianity from the first followers of Jesus in Jerusalem throughout Syro-Palestine. This is also described in the Acts of the Apostles. The earliest Christian mission, then, the Great Commission and dispersion of the Apostles, was active within Second Temple Judaism, as Christianity had not yet split from Judaism. Whether a Jewish proselytism existed or not that would have served as a model for the early Christians is unclear. See circumcision controversy in early Christianity #Jewish background for details. Soon, the expansion of the Christian mission beyond Judaism to those who were not Jewish became a contested issue, notably at the Council of Jerusalem. The Apostle Paul was an early proponent of this expansion, and contextualized the Christian message for the Greek and Roman cultures, permitting it to reach beyond its Hebrew and Jewish roots. From late antiquity onward, much missionary activity was carried out by members of religious orders. Monasteries followed disciplines and supported missions, libraries, and practical research, all of which were perceived as works to reduce human misery and suffering and glorify the Christian God. For example, Nestorian communities evangelized parts of Central Asia. Cistercians evangelized much of Northern Europe, as well as developing most of European agriculture's classic techniques. St. Patrick evangelized many in Ireland. St. David was active in Wales. During the Middle Ages, Ramon Lull advanced the concept of preaching to Muslims and converting them to Christianity by means of non-violent argument. A vision for large-scale mission to Muslims would die with him, not to be revived until the 19th century. Additional events can be found at the timeline of Christian missions. Medieval. During the Middle Ages, Christian monasteries and missionaries such as St. Patrick and Adalbert of Prague propagated learning and religion beyond the boundaries of the old Roman Empire. In the 7th century, Gregory the Great sent missionaries, including Augustine of Canterbury, into England. The Hibernia Scottish mission began in 563. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, Franciscans such as William of Ruybrook, John of Montecorvino, and Giovanni ed Magnolia were sent as missionaries to the Near and Far East. Their travels took them as far as China in an attempt to convert the advancing Mongols, especially the great Khans of the Mongol Empire. Catholic missions. After 1492, one of the main goals of the Christopher Columbus expedition, financed by Queen Isabella of Spain, was to spread Christianity. During the Age of Discovery, Spain and Portugal established many missions in their American and Asian colonies. The most active orders were the Jesuits, Augustinians, Franciscans, and Dominicans. The Portuguese sent missions into Africa. These are some of the most well-known missions in history. While some of these missions were associated with imperialism and oppression, others were relatively peaceful and focused on integration rather than cultural imperialism. In both Portugal and Spain, religion was an integral part of the state and evangelization was seen as having both secular and spiritual benefits. Wherever these powers attempted to expand their territories or influence, missionaries would soon follow. By the Treaty of Tordesillas, the two powers divided the world between them into exclusive spheres of influence, trade and colonization. The proselytization of Asia became linked to Portuguese colonial policy. Catholic missions in Asia. Portuguese trade with Asia rapidly proved profitable from 1499 onwards, and as Jesuits arrived in India around 1540, the colonial government in Goa supported the mission with incentives for baptized Christians. Later, the Church sent Jesuits to China and to other countries in Asia. Protestant missions. The Reformation unfolded in Europe in the early 16th century. For over 100 years, occupied by their struggle with the Catholic Church. The early Protestant churches as a body were not missionary-sending churches. But in the centuries that followed, the Protestant churches began sending out missionaries in increasing numbers, spreading the proclamation of the Christian message to previously unreached people. In North America, missionaries to the Native Americans included Jonathan Edwards, the well-known preacher of the Great Awakening, who in his later years retired from the very public life of his early career. He became a missionary to the Housatonic Native Americans and a staunch advocate for them against cultural imperialism, as European culture has been established in the midst of indigenous peoples. The cultural distance between Christians of differing cultures has been difficult to overcome. One early solution was the creation of segregated, praying towns, of Christian natives. This pattern of grudging acceptance of converts played out again later in Hawaii when missionaries from that same New England culture went there. In the course of the Spanish colonization of the Americas, the Catholic missionaries learned the languages of the Amerindians and devised writing systems for them. Then they preached to indigenous people in those languages instead of Spanish, to keep Indians away from sinful whites. An extreme case of segregation occurred in the Guarani Reductions, a theocratic semi-independent region established by the Jesuits in the region of the future Paraguay between the early 17th century and 1767. From 1732 onwards, the Moravian Church began sending out missionaries. Around 1780, an indigent Baptist cobbler named William Carey began reading about James Cook's travels voyages in Polynesia. His interest grew to a furious sort of backwards homesickness, inspiring him to obtain Baptist orders, and eventually to write his famous 1792 pamphlet, An Inquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of Heathen. Far from a dry book of theology, Carey's work used the best available geographic and ethnographic data to map and count the number of people who had never heard the gospel. It inspired a movement that has grown with increasing speed from his day to the present. In the United States, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions was chartered in 1812. Protestant missionaries from the Anglican and Lutheran and Presbyterian traditions starting arriving in what was then the Ottoman Empire in the first half of the 19th century. This eventually led to the creation of what are today the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land and the See of the Anglican Bishop in Jerusalem. Furthermore, it was during this time that the Christian and Missionary Alliance started their missionary activity in Jerusalem. American hard-shell Baptists, anti-mission Baptists, or Old School Baptists, adhering to strict Calvinists, rejected all mission boards, Bible tract societies, and temperance societies as non-biblical. The mainstream of the Baptist denomination, however, supported missionary work. Thomas Coke, the first bishop of the American Methodists, was the father of Methodist missions. After spending time in the newly formed United States of America strengthening the infant Methodist Church alongside Episcopal colleague Francis Asbury, the British-born Coke left for mission work. During his time in America, Coke worked vigorously to increase Methodist support of Christian missions and of raising up mission workers. Coke died while on a mission trip to India, but his legacy among Methodists, his passion for missions, continues. China. A wave of missions, starting in the early 1850s, targeted inland areas, led by Hudson Taylor with his China Inland Mission. Taylor was later supported by Henry Grattan Guinness, who founded Cliff College, which continues as of 2014. Update: to train and equip for local and global mission. The missions inspired by Taylor and Guinness have collectively been called faith missions, and owe much to the ideas and example of Anthony Norris. Groves. Taylor, a thoroughgoing nativist, offended the missionaries of his era by wearing Chinese clothing and speaking Chinese at home. His books, Speaking, and Examples led to the formation of numerous inland missions and of the student volunteer movement, which from 1850 to about 1950 sent nearly 10,000 missionaries to inland areas, often at great personal sacrifice. Many early SVM missionaries traveling to areas with endemic tropical diseases left with their belongings packed in a coffin, aware that 80% of them would die within 2 years. British Empire in the 18th century, and even more so in the 19th century. Missionaries based in Britain saw the empire as a fertile field for proselytizing for Christianity. All the main denominations were involved, including the Church of England, the Presbyterians of Scotland, and the Nonconformists. Much of the enthusiasm emerged from the evangelical revival. Within the Church of England, the Church Mission Society originated in 1799 and went on to undertake activity all around the world, including in what became known as the Middle East. Before the American Revolution, Anglican and Methodist missionaries were active in the 13 colonies. The Methodists, led by George Whitefield, were the most successful, and after the Revolution an entirely distinct American Methodist denomination emerged that became the largest Protestant denomination in the new United States. A major problem for colonial officials was the demand of the Church of England to set up an American bishop. This was strongly opposed by most of the Americans had never happened. Increasingly, colonial officials took a neutral position on religious matters, even in those colonies such as Virginia where the Church of England was officially established, but in practice controlled by laymen in the local vestries. After the Americans broke free, British officials decided to enhance the power and wealth of the Church of England in all the settler colonies, especially British North America. Missionary societies funded their own operations that were not supervised or directed by the colonial office. Tensions emerged between the missionaries and the colonial officials. The latter feared that missionaries might stir up trouble or encourage the natives to challenge colonial authority. In general, colonial officials were much more comfortable with working with the established local leadership, including the native religions, rather than introducing the divisive force of Christianity. This proved especially troublesome in India, where very few local elites were attracted to Christianity. In Africa, especially, the missionaries made many converts. Of the 21st century, there were more Anglicans in Nigeria than in England. Missionaries increasingly came to focus on education, medical help, and long-term modernization of the native personality to inculcate European middle-class values. They established schools and medical clinics. Christian missionaries played a public role, especially in promoting sanitation and public health. Many were trained as physicians, or took special courses in public health and tropical medicine at Livingston College, London. After 1870, by the 1870s, Protestant missions around the world generally acknowledged the long-term material goal was the formation of independent, self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating churches. The rise of nationalism in the Third World provoked challenges from critics who complained that the missionaries were teaching Western ways and ignoring the indigenous culture. The Boxer Rebellion in China in 1898 involved very large-scale attacks on Christian missions and their converts. The First World War diverted resources, and pulled most Germans out of missionary work when that country lost its empire. The worldwide Great Depression of the 1930s was a major blow to funding mission activities. In 1910, the Edinburgh Missionary Conference was presided over by active SVM and YMCA leader John R. Mott, an American Methodist layperson. The conference reviewed the state of evangelism, Bible translation, mobilization of church support, and the training of indigenous leadership. Looking to the future, conferees worked on strategies for worldwide evangelism and cooperation. The conference not only established greater ecumenical cooperation in missions, but also essentially launched the modern ecumenical movement. The next wave of missions was started by two missionaries, Cameron Townsend and Donald McGavran, around 1935. These men realized that although earlier missionaries had reached geographic areas, there were numerous ethnographic groups that were isolated by language or class from the groups that missionaries had reached. Cameron formed Wycliffe Bible translators to translate the Bible into native languages. McGavran concentrated on finding bridges to cross the class and cultural barriers in places like India, which has upwards of 4,600 peoples, separated by a combination of language, culture, and caste. Despite democratic reforms, caste and class differences are still fundamental in many cultures. An equally important dimension of missions strategy is the indigenous method of nationals reaching their own people. In Asia, this wave of missions was pioneered by men like Dr. G. D. James of Singapore, Rev. Theodore Williams of India, and Dr. David Cho of Korea. The two-thirds missions movement, as it is referred to, is today a major force in missions. Most modern missionaries and missionary societies have repudiated cultural imperialism, and elected to focus on spreading the gospel and translating the Bible. Sometimes, missionaries have been vital in preserving and documenting the culture of the peoples among whom they live. Often, missionaries provide welfare and health services, as a good deed or to make friends with the locals. Thousands of schools, orphanages, and hospitals have been established by missions. One service provided by missionaries was the Each One, Teach One literacy program begun by Dr. Frank Law back in the Philippines in 1935. The program has since spread around the world and brought literacy to the least enabled members of many societies. During this period, missionaries, especially evangelical and Pentecostal missionaries, witnessed a substantial increase in the number of conversions of Muslims to Christianity. In an interview published in 2013, a leader of a key missionary agency focused on Muslims claimed that the world is living in a day of salvation for Muslims everywhere. The word mission was historically often applied to the building, the mission station, in which the missionary lives or works. In some colonies, these mission stations became a focus of settlement of displaced or formerly nomadic people. Particularly in rural Australia, missions have become localities or ghettos on the edges of towns which are home to many Indigenous Australians. The word may be seen as derogatory when used in this context. Additional events can be found at the timeline of Christian missions.